Good morning and welcome to the DME for Peace community. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. These Thursday Talks on DME for Peace are made possible with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York through the Peace Building Evaluation Consortium. Just in case you've forgotten, my name is Jack Farrell and I am the DME for Peace Project Manager at Search for Common Ground based here in Washington, DC. Today I am delighted to welcome Gabrielle Plotkin and Dani de Garcia of Social Impact, who will be leading a discussion on challenges and practical tools for managing developmental evaluations. A note about our format today, for those of you who are new to the Thursday Talks, once Gabrielle and Dani have finished their presentation, we'll jump right into questions and answers. And you can ask your question in advance of the discussion portion by submitting them through the question function on GoToWebinar throughout the presentation. I'm now going to hand it over to today's hosts. Dani and Gabrielle, you are very welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you, Jack, and good morning to everyone. Thanks for tuning in. We're really excited to be hosting this Thursday talk on developmental evaluation. My name is Gabrielle Plotkin. I'm a program manager at Social Impact, and I'm joined by my colleague,
Dani de Garcia. I'm the Director of Performance Evaluation at Social Impact.
For those of you who aren't familiar with Social Impact, we are a management consulting firm that is best known for our work doing monitoring and evaluation, although we also dabble in strategic planning and capacity building. But Dani and I are situated in our performance evaluation division, so that's how we spend a lot of our times doing evaluations primarily for USAID, as in the case of the project that we're going to discuss today, but also for a whole range of other U.S. government agencies, private philanthropies, NGOs, and other clients. So we will be speaking from experience, and I'll go ahead and tell you about exactly which experience that is. So since October 2015, almost 3 years now, Dani and I have worked on a project called DEPA-MERL. DEPA stands for the Developmental Evaluation Pilot Activity. And this is an initiative of the Global Development Lab at USAID. They have a program called the Monitoring, Evaluation, Research, and Learning Initiative, which has the fantastic acronym of MERLIN. And as part of this, the lab's mandate within the agency is to bring innovation to USAID. So what they've done on the MERLIN program is try to experiment with different M&E approaches that have not been used at the agency previously. So we, with our partners, which are named below, Search for Common Ground is one, and the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan is another. We have joined together to try out developmental evaluation at USAID, and we are doing up to 6 during the course of this particular project. We've just wrapped up the first one, which was actually spearheaded by Search for Common Ground. That was working on a child protection program in Cambodia. The other pilot that we have is actually looks at part of the Global Development Lab's own work and how they sort of mainstream their own innovations that aren't M&E related to both internal and external stakeholders. So part of what we're doing is not just actually doing developmental evaluation, but generating and disseminating learning about DE within the evaluation community, because what we found going into this is that there is sort of a relative lack of practical guidance on how to implement DE. So we're pleased to be sharing what we've learned along the way. To that end, we've sort of aggregated our learnings to date, mostly from launching developmental evaluations. In this guide, which I have a little snapshot of the title here, it's called Tips, Tools, and Templates. This is a living document that we're seeking to add to, especially as we close developmental evaluation pilots and start new ones. As you'll see, we just published this in September, and again, we'll be adding to it. But the chapters in the latest edition, as you see here on the screen, are about starting developmental evaluations, identifying evaluators. We have a section on budgeting for developmental evaluation and getting evaluators sort of prepared to launch developmental evaluations. We have an upcoming chapter, we also have one on developmental evaluation deliverables. We here at Social Impact in particular, and maybe this is your experience as well, are quite accustomed to writing lengthy text-heavy reports, which is sort of a more traditional product of evaluations, but developmental evaluation is very concerned with utilization and trying to come up with deliverables that are easy to use and useful and appealing. So before we go on, I'd like to ask Jack to please pull up a poll. We just wanted to get a sense of what people are generally interested in within these topics, just so we know how to sort of weight the slides. So if you could just go ahead and take a moment to fill that in, we'd love to be utilization focused in our own approach to this talk, and hear what's most interesting to you folks. I'll give you a few seconds to respond.
While you're responding, that I just want to add about this book that we've published, or toolkit. It's on the link for DME for Peace under developmental evaluation, but there are also templates under there. So we have a sample terms of reference for a developmental evaluator, sample budget categories, and other things that you can download, take, use, modify to make it useful to you.
We'll get to this at the end too, but we're also taking suggestions on things that people would like to see. So if you're out there doing a DE or are thinking about doing one and there's something that doesn't exist in the world yet, we would love to help make that happen. Okay.
So Jack, it seems like we are not able to see the poll results yet. Feel free to...
They should be up right now, and just a reminder on GoToWebinar polls, you can vote multiple times, hence the far greater than 100% polling result. Can you guys see the poll right now?
Not yet.
Okay, well, I can run over. 14% said staffing DEs, 51% said launching DEs, 71% said managing DEs, and 59% said creating DE deliverables.
Perfect. We will spend more time on managing and then kind of equally divide ourselves on launching and creating, and a little less on the staffing side. Great. Thank you all.
Okay, so we have again launched 2 DEs, which is not that many in number, but it has been a lot of effort and there's been a great deal of learning around those. And I think one of the biggest things that we have taken away from this is, as you see on the screen, the importance of what we call acculturation. This is a process that begins, frankly, on day 0. From the moment people even begin talking about DEs, it's important to sensitize stakeholders to what DE actually is, what it is not, and trying to get buy-in for what the particular focus or modus operandi of a particular DE is. DE is, of course, a pretty amorphous and flexible approach to evaluation, so it can look like a lot of different things. And one of the biggest challenges we face in trying to secure pilots with various potential clients is misconceptions around what DE is and can or cannot do. So this, the major takeaway that we have, even once people say, yes, we're bought in, it's going to focus on X, is the fact that acculturation is a process that is both formal and informal. Here in the pictures you'll see these are images from different acculturation workshops that we've held, in which we take 1 or 2 days to get all of the necessary stakeholders in the room. We start out by just doing DE 101. This is what it is. This is why it exists. Here's what it can do for you. And once that's established, we spend literally up to 2 days understanding what are the different needs that the stakeholders have. How can the DE help serve those needs? We always want to keep utilization in mind. So with the aid of sticky notes and flip charts and stakeholder mapping, we figure out what are the priorities. How can we make sure that this effort, these resources, best serve the different folks who are part of this. But the process really does not end there. And as our evaluators have found, acculturation is an ongoing process. It's a daily or weekly or monthly constant reminder of folks of why this is important, why they should be participating and bought in. One of our evaluators talks about the importance of making quick wins and showing those to people. Like, this is what the DE got you. These findings helped you make this adaptation, or some other version of that, which really helps people to continuously develop a better understanding of what DE is and why it matters. And that makes the DE all the more successful.
And a couple of notes on just our lessons learned here. So one is that we recommend actually holding this workshop at typically a couple of weeks into the developmental evaluation, after the evaluator's already been able to collect some data and show that they can speak knowledgeably about the organization or the processes or activities, and can also show some data to show that it's not just their perceptions, but maybe if they've coded data or have direct observation or something else that they can show tangibly. The other is that acculturation happens before you do the DE, which Gabrielle mentioned. And then often this process is not only saying what a developmental evaluation is, but what it is not, to make sure that this is the right fit for an intervention and that expectations are aligned before you get going. So the next one we have is just on budgeting, and budgeting for developmental evaluation can be pretty difficult, in part because the idea behind it is really that it's flexible and adaptive to needs. So you don't want to presuppose certain data collection activities. So we have a template in this book that Gabrielle mentioned, but basically the key points to take away are try to cover your bases and think through what each activity might look like. And also just to create room for flexibility. If that's a line item that is just for data collection and don't specify what that is, there's obviously, depending on who you're working with, very different levels of comfort with that. I know our contracts and budget office does not like developmental evaluation as much as we do, in part because of this ambiguity and the lack of specificity at the outset. I know USAID is also looking at ways to incorporate flexible procurement mechanisms and funding mechanisms to accommodate this more adaptive management style. If you're doing an internal developmental evaluation, it may be a little bit easier. Similarly, the difference between grants and contracts can create different aspects for budgeting that you need to be aware of. Typically, a developmental evaluation incorporates at least one full-time staff, and that staff is full-time on the developmental evaluation. They're embedded in the project. We found that it's really helpful to have support staff because you don't know what skills will be needed, what types of data will be collected, what types of analysis you might need, that you want to budget in some room for surge support, and even just brainstorming and thought, kind of thinking through these different aspects.
Yeah, just one more note on that. I know that there's a great deal of interest in managing evaluations, which doesn't have its own slide here. We do have resources on that, and we're happy to talk about it. We've learned a lot, but I think the importance of having a backup person or team cannot be understated. We hold a series of embedded evaluator clinics that are limited to a group of people that are actively working on developmental evaluations, and everybody has talked about the importance of having a manager who can sort of help make sure that the DE stays on course, look at big picture things that might get lost when someone's sort of in the weeds of a project, and also to make sure that that objectivity that is so important to evaluation is maintained.
On the deliverable side, we often find that this is a big question for people, that they have a hard time buying into a developmental evaluation without first understanding, okay, what does it look like? What will it give me? It's one of the hardest parts of generating buy-in, and they don't like to hear the answer, it depends. But what we found is that, it really does depend. And so far, we've used a lot of different types of deliverables. Depending on the stakeholder, some of them do like to see some sort of formal report. Others really don't want that. So far we've created visual timelines. We've done stakeholder maps. You see a kind of empty temperature gauge survey thing that we did, where we did case studies and just did not want to report. So we just used this as a presentation with arrows and showing which direction things were headed and where, based on participant responses, stakeholders felt they were. We've done a lot of 2-page briefs, infographics, strategic learning debriefs. We found that options memos have been really helpful, laying out some different recommendations or options forward along with their implications. But basically the key is understanding your audience. So some of the things we've learned through managing these is that some audiences believe certain types of data or certain types of presentation of data. So understanding, what does your audience find credible? If they don't find the qualitative data credible, maybe we need to quantify that data or collect different types of data. Maybe, senior level stakeholders really want a 1-page brief to be able to flip through it and understand it. Others want the level of detail to be able to find it, credible as a data source. So thinking through what they want and making sure you adjust the deliverables accordingly. Now, the closing out developmental evaluations, we're still pretty new to this. So our practical guidance, I don't think, is as well fleshed out as some of the other ones. But what we're finding is that there are a couple of key elements when we're closing out a developmental evaluation. The first is really ensuring that you have your documentation in place, that the users can really go back, see what changes were made, understand why decisions were made so they don't kind of reinvent the wheel as they go forward. Reminding people and revisiting adaptations to date is really crucial, in part to set the stage for sustainability. So reminding people that there have been adaptations and here were the impacts of those adaptations, and maybe you should continue using maybe not developmental evaluation, but that kind of adaptive management mindset moving forward. We found, at least so far, we don't think that's been too difficult because they have seen the value add of these interventions, of the developmental evaluation itself. But you're really working on setting that stage so that the mindset and the growth and adaptation continues even following the close of the developmental evaluation.
Great. So I know the most fun part is the Q&A, and we're more or less at the time that Jack has given us to present, and we're very curious to hear what is on your mind, what is more interesting to you and that you'd like to hear more about. We've put up our emails here on the screen for your reference in case we haven't touched upon anything or don't get to it in the Q&A, but we love getting questions on DE. So please do not hesitate to get in touch with us if you have questions or suggestions. As I mentioned, we are constantly trying to update our guidance, so very much open to suggestions on things you'd like to see. And with that, I think, Jack, do we have questions from the audience?
Yes, they are flying in thick and fast. But firstly, thank you very much, Gabrielle and Dani, for a really great presentation. Just a note for the audience, the tools, tips, and templates document is available on DME for Peace. So please feel free to look at the developmental evaluation community. And just before we enter the Q&A, I want to make a couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question one of two ways. The first way you can submit a question is, like I said at the beginning of the webinar, it's through the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard. The second is to click on the hand icon, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask you to submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace, so those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion and learn from our wider engagement. Now, the first question, I'm going to pull these up right now, is it comes from Jeshri Thakrar. And Jeshri Thakrar says, how have you handled quality assurance of the developmental evaluation outputs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is one of the the reasons that we think having a manager and backstop and surge support is so crucial. So I think there are different levels of outputs. You know, there are certainly things on a daily basis that we trust our embedded evaluators to be able to produce or talk to directly with their users. We don't want to serve as a bottleneck. So if they are just, you know, presenting on results of a meeting, or somebody asks for advice in a quick manner, then absolutely we don't get in the way. But we have established really open lines of communication so that our embedded evaluators come to us as their kind of home office support staff and say, hey, can you read through this? Anytime we have a written deliverable or product, we do try to do some quality assurance on it. Often what that's meant is that it's good to have another set of eyes and say, ooh, you're not really presenting the data behind that, or it doesn't come across as objective as it should. Where did you come up with this finding or recommendation? We need to see the data. Or you can present this in a more visual way. Here are some tips. So we do that from our home office. We also, they reach out to us pretty regularly when they have some more kind of ad hoc requests. And I think that open relationship, the fact that we're not serving kind of an audit and checking your work, it's more of a kind of a collaborative effort to ensure that we're meeting the client needs, has been really useful. So both of these two evaluations on this project, for example, the developmental evaluators reached out pretty regularly anytime they had questions or wanted a second set of eyes, and that has been particularly useful.
Yeah, I would say that my reviews for quality assurance, at least of written deliverables, there are a few lenses that I use to review. First is, again, is this grounded in findings? Are the findings triangulated? Things that you would want to see in a traditional evaluation report. So that's more of the technical angle. I also look at deliverables for, as Dani mentioned, accessibility of information. If I'm handed something that I think could be better condensed in a graph or bullet points, whatever, I try to figure out what is the best way to digest this information. Because sometimes we can default to sort of text-heavy reports. I think that's what a lot of us are used to. I look for copy edits. Those are the three sort of levels of QA that I look for when I'm reviewing anything written. I would say if we're looking at, you know, those are for products. We also look at things like interview protocols or, you know, survey instruments, things like that. And that would be sort of a standard technical review, just making sure that things are worded in a way that makes sense. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you guys, and thank you for that question, Thackeras. The next question comes from Jacqueline Tancredi, who, special shout out, is a current participant on DME for Peace's mentorship program, known as the Peace Project. Jacqueline asks, how many workshops would you recommend to write a process of a 6-month project, for example?
I assume this is for a Culturation Workshop?
Yes, I'm going to assume that too.
I think it depends on how many people are involved. We've actually found on our pilots that at least 2 separate workshops actually have been quite helpful. We've done them for sort of one for decision makers at the very top, people who are either paying for the, you know, funding a DE, or you know, the people that are intimately involved with the leadership of the program, because that buy-in is super important. We usually start there. In the program, the child protection program that we did a DE of, there were a ton of stakeholders, and it really was important for people to understand why our evaluator was hanging around, making demands of their time for interviews or requesting information. So we did sort of a lighter touch, a Culturation Workshop, just to sensitize everyone to like who this person is and why it matters. So it depends, again, I would say, depending on the nature of your program, but I think at minimum 1, possibly 2, depending on what your situation is.
The other factor that I think is important there is how much you're trying to take on through your developmental evaluation. So what we found is that it's helpful to have 1 or 2 kind of overarching questions to guide the developmental evaluator as they begin. If we expect that they're going to be able to be relatively quick answers to those, you may want another acculturation workshop when that question is finished to basically come together and prioritize the next question. If you think that will take its full 6 months and that it'll just go in different ways in trying to answer that one question, then one acculturation workshop may be enough if it's a small group of stakeholders. With the high-level management buy-in, you don't want too many people in the room. You don't want 100 people. You want them to really be convinced of what the purpose is of this developmental evaluation and what they can and cannot expect. So if it's a large group, as Gabrielle mentioned, you may want to siphon it off into 2 groups. If it's just a small group of actors, then one may be enough.
And I would be remiss as a program manager not to mention, the reality of budget constraints. You have to, oftentimes we don't have the luxury of planning as many workshops as we would like. So that is, always a reality that I think we're all aware of. But, if you are only operating within a 6-month timeline, I would say, do what's realistic or make good use of the time if you really only have the resources to do one.
And for a 6-month project, ACculturation is not the only type of workshop. So just remember that you may also, at the end of the developmental evaluation, have some more recommendations or findings that you want to workshop through as part of your sustainability and making sure that they talk through them. So don't limit your workshops to just the orientation and ACculturation.
Indeed.
Very good, thank you guys. The next question comes from Steve Peck, who I actually see this question a couple of times from a couple of different users, but you have mentioned that you've only done 2 developmental evaluations. Is that because there is no demand for them, they're too costly to do, or generally only applicable for a very specific situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the parameters of this particular contract definitely limit us. So we are unable to really kind of publicly market for these. But also the way the contract is structured for this one, we do have some cost components that increase the cost. And part of that is because the underlying principle behind the Merlin mechanism is to also kind of evaluate what's happening and spread learning, which means that anytime a project or mission buys in, they also have to buy in to a huge additional cost potentially, which is really in the area of monitoring and evaluating the evaluation itself. So we have a more limited number of missions who are as interested in that cost. That said, there are certainly additional reasons. One is that developmental evaluation is new, especially within the confines of the US agency and bureaucracy. It is really kind of the first time, and we talk about kind of the penguin effect, that all the penguins wait for one to jump in. We've had a lot of initial interest, but I think it's hard for people to really wrap their minds around what developmental evaluation is. We are seeing added interest now that we have some of these products. People are hearing about it. The other, I think, big issue is it is more expensive than traditional evaluation. You are paying for a full-time staff member typically, sometimes more. We are currently outside of this contract, probably doing another developmental evaluation that's 5 full-time staff members on the developmental evaluation team. So it can be pricey. So I think there's a number of reasons for that, but definitely the parameters of this contract, the fact that it's new, and the cost are all relevant and key here.
Yeah, I think that especially in that sort of bureaucratic context, people generally tend to be risk averse. And so the idea of having this sort of not very well defined product where we can't tell them exactly what our methods are going to be, exactly what the outputs will look like, makes people nervous. And so it was quite a great feat to secure too, but it has helped drum up interest for others. But I would say that, yeah, the amorphous nature is something that people certainly aren't used to, and then they see the price of it, and that doesn't help.
The last part of it is difficult to budget for these, and I think you're seeing more developmental evaluations, I think, happen internally as opposed to through the U.S. government bureaucracy, in part because it's hard to specify specific deliverables at the outset. Same with budget. So you can have parameters and there are ways to do it, but it's one of the reasons that USAID is looking into alternative procurement mechanisms and ways to finance, because it is difficult, and you do have contracts officers and some financial people that are less comfortable with that level of ambiguity.
Great, thank you, Dani and Gabrielle, for the detailed answer. Our next question comes from Catherine Borgman Arboleda, and Catherine asks, how do you deal with internal issues that are affecting external outcomes? For example, organization dynamics, internal issues being a lack of capacity with certain program officers, and tough relationships between evaluators and program staff?
Yeah, it's a great question, and at least especially on one of our evaluations, something that we have really had to deal with intimately. Some kind of difficult organizational dynamics, and because the findings were less than positive initially, it created some tension. So I think there's a couple of ways. One is really understanding the different users and what their needs are. The second is really forcing the evaluator to take a step back and make sure that how they're presenting the data and the findings and their products show the data sources, so where it's coming from, that it's not their perception, but that it really is based on evidence. I think that's a really crucial one. The other part is really focusing on communication and open channels of communication. So ensuring that there are formal and informal conversations, that there's documentation when necessary, and that all of the doors are open, that if you disagree, let's talk about it. Why do you disagree? Do we need to collect more data, or is it just something that you're unhappy with? I think one of the other strategies that our evaluators and us as managers have taken is to try to balance these different relationships and needs. So for example, one of our evaluations, the first evaluation question that was kind of guiding, took a long time, and it was really laced with some tension and organizational dynamics between the different actors. And so when we started to kind of change course and do the next question, we really wanted to focus on some successes and showing that the pieces that were more positive than necessarily came out in the second part, so that it was able to balance those relationships in a way that people didn't just assume we were digging into the problems, and they had that need to see something more optimistic and what can we replicate and scale. So understanding the drivers behind some of the positive deviance studies.
Yeah, I would say that the first research question in this DE that Dani was talking about really set us up to be looking at those internal dynamics, which frankly may not have been the best place to start. It was really rocky, so we did take a turn for a more appreciative look. The two things that I would add are, I think this question really points us to the importance of hiring evaluators that have really strong soft skills, that are great facilitators, excellent diplomats, good communicators. We talk about this in our guide. You really just can't have anyone step into this role, because you can have all the technical skills in the world, but that does not necessarily equip you to be on the in really difficult situations like this. Luckily, we've hired some people that are really excellent in navigating those situations, and that's something that you got to look for when you're hiring. The last point I'll make on this is, again, going back to the importance of having a backup team or a program manager. This is something that I understand from our sort of intimate community of practice that we've set up through our clinics. Not everybody has this luxury, but it's so important to have someone who can sort of distinguish the forest from the trees, because they're one step removed. That person can also play bad cop if needed when things get a little bit hairy and the evaluator is put in an awkward position. That can be a tremendous boon to the evaluation process.
Great, thank you guys. The next question comes from Colin Jacobs. And Colin asks, how flexible can you really be? Presumably, you have to frame this and limit it, or you can set yourself up to fail. Could you possibly give an example or two?
Sure. So it's a valid question. And I think with respect to the flexibility, the way we've tried to structure it, and I don't want to say that this is always the best way to go, is that we do try to start with the purpose of the developmental evaluation and some initial research questions to drive it. So, for example, this first developmental evaluation that we've mentioned, they started off with a research question, and very quickly, numbers of actors wanted our evaluator to kind of run in 1,000 directions and respond to their immediate needs, and had lots of requests for the evaluator for meetings and deliverables and things like that. And he was very accommodating for probably a little too long, and we did have to walk it back and say, this is not, while these are interesting uses of your time, they are not tied to the purpose of the developmental evaluation or the initial research questions. So we do need to stop being quite so flexible. The other evaluation that we're doing, on the other hand, we've had a lot of kind of smaller requests that were not anticipated, but very much fit within kind of the context and underlying needs and research questions. So, for example, understanding the timeline of how a specific bureau or initiative was, what their staffing and strategic plans were and how that evolved over time. That was certainly not something that we had envisioned preparing or delving into, but it was really necessary to understand the context of them and therefore their approach to uptake. So I think there's certainly boundaries on that level of flexibility. I would argue that those boundaries really need to be within the confines of why are we doing this evaluation, and what are the initial guiding questions. Now, you expect the questions to change over time, so I think there are also there are times when you need to say, okay, we've gone so far off of this, it's evident that there are other needs, so let's get back together and see if we need to change course as a group so that everybody's on the same page. If everybody's on the same page and it fits within your resources, then I think you can be very flexible. The difficulty is when you have different actors who all require different amounts and different types of flexibility.
Yeah. I don't have too much more to add. I think in terms of changing the research question, that's sort of a big ordeal, but certainly changing, being flexible with timelines on when you're supposed to, when you would like to finish X activity. That's something I think we feel quite comfortable being as flexible as our evaluation stakeholders are willing to be. We just run with what they need, and that's great. If you have to change the method, for example, we were doing a case study recently in which we were planning to do some outcome harvesting. After a little while, we realized that that was actually not going to work very well. So we switched that up. And I think everyone was okay with that. That kind of flexibility is really helpful. I think the scope question is the trickier one to navigate, as Dani said.
Thank you, guys. Our next question comes from Vanessa Corlazzoli, and special shout out to Vanessa for joining us today. It's great to see you online. Vanessa is one of the founders of DME for Peace, so it's always great to have her participation. And Vanessa's question is, what advice would you give for implementing a slow developmental evaluation? The client is interested in the approach, but doesn't have time to meet and iterate as often as they would like. How do you keep momentum and still capture changes that are taking place without regular engagement?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I think one of the things we found is that if the client is really not fully bought in, it can be really hard to do a meaningful developmental evaluation. I know outside of this, I'm working on a developmental evaluation that's in a similar place. What I think a couple of pieces. One is to make sure that developmental evaluation really is right for that project or those users. It does require inputs, and so making sure that is the right approach is the first step. Now, if they've decided it's the right approach and they're willing to invest their time, I think it's a matter of setting expectations about exactly what's needed from them. If the evaluator is able to play a more passive role in observing and they're copied on, typical correspondence and able to document, issues and trends and whatever it is, then it may require less, but there's still going to be a need for maybe it's regular strategic learning debriefs or something that, every 2 weeks or every month, they meet and talk through, what are we finding so far? What does this mean? I know you don't want to meet every week, but I need you to make a decision on whether or not to move forward so that way I can track that way. And just setting some really common parameters. I think in these cases, the time required of the evaluation stakeholders can be intimidating. So the necessity of really showing value add early on is crucial. So having some quick wins to say, here's what we found, here's how you can use it, implement, go, tends to build that momentum and show people that it's worth their time to invest.
Yeah, I was going to make that exact point. I think to the extent that you can either find or create quick wins, the better off you'll be. We try to get ahead of this issue by being very upfront, if not exaggerating, the our communications around what this will require, and if we sense that they're not up to it, then we have the luxury of walking away, which it doesn't sound like you do, but to be completely honest, that's kind of how we've dealt with it.
Thank you, guys. Next question comes from Zack Tilton, and Zack asks, are there any public or shareable deliverables from the child protection developmental evaluation you've mentioned?
Oh,
good question.
So we are in the process of closing it out. Most of them really have been internal. I think there are some that we could certainly talk with the client about sharing. Because they are made for an internal audience, though, some of them do have pretty sensitive information, some procurement stuff and otherwise. I think we'd be happy to share some of the templates and tools that we've used in presenting findings. I don't know how much of the content is going to be publicly accessible, just because it is an ongoing initiative. So the developmental evaluation is closing out, but the initiative is continuing. So we're happy to talk to the client if there are specific requests and see what they're willing to be made available.
Yeah, we are working on something that will be more publicly facing, but I actually don't expect that most of it is shareable, unfortunately.
Great, thank you guys for clarifying. The next question, and we're going to use this as our last question, comes from Myra Chavarria. And apologies, Myra, if I have butchered your name. Myra asks, do you have trainings for monitoring and evaluation folks in the US government that could facilitate the developmental evaluation and lower the cost of the developmental evaluation?
I think this question is about having USAID staff serve as developmental evaluators. Is that also your sense? Yeah,
that's how I'd interpret it, just to essentially not have to bring in an external evaluator to lower the cost. Like, how do you train someone to be a developmental evaluator? Yes.
Yeah, no,
Myra told me that's correct.
I think right now we don't offer trainings on that. And one of the reasons is because the developmental evaluator toolkit, I think what we're finding are that the skills to be an embedded evaluator are not necessarily those you can train in. So there are trainings out there. We've done some workshops. There are others publicly available from Michael Quinn-Patton and others on kind of developmental evaluation 101. The key that we've realized is that things like the diplomacy and the communication are not really trainable skills. So it's a matter of aligning the person correctly with the opportunity. For one developmental evaluation, for example, for a health project, the stakeholders need the evaluators to be really credible in the health space with senior level government officials. When that's the case, that's not something that the evaluation side we can train in, but really requires previous experience with ministry level officials in the health sector. There are pieces that can be trained. I think in terms of lowering the cost and having internal evaluators, it's something that we're seeing USAID try. It's also something that we're seeing some NGOs and CSOs try as a way to lower cost. Now, as part of our embedded evaluator clinics that are open to embedded evaluators and managers kind of outside of this contract, we found that there are kind of pros and cons to that. It does lower the cost, but there are a number of challenges with respect to maintaining objectivity and credibility that some of them are running into. Similarly with the backstopping support. So there are ways to do it. I think it's important to recognize the pros and cons that come along with it. It certainly can lower the cost, but the ability, or how that individual is perceived by the team, how their data is perceived to be credible or influenced by personal relationships and experience, you do have to be aware of before kind of placing that individual accordingly.
Yeah, final thought and shameless plug, we have actually proposed an AEA workshop, one-day workshop this fall, and to sort of gear up evaluators for DEs. Fingers crossed it'll be approved, but look out for that in the fall.
Great, thank you very much, Gabrielle and Dani. On that workshop at AEA, if and fingers crossed it goes ahead, we'll be sure to share that information out with the wider DME for Peace community. I think there's huge interest in this topic and methodology based off the fact that I don't think I've ever seen so many questions come through an M&E Thursday talk. And I'm sorry to those of you we didn't get to today, but hopefully we can add them to the discussion page and continue this on DME for Peace. Thank you once again to Gabrielle and Dani for being fantastic hosts. And thank you for the DME for Peace community for joining another great webinar. We're averaging over 100 attendees every single week, making this the biggest M&E webinar series around. And it's your webinar series, so if you're interested in hosting an M&E Thursday talk or you're working on something interesting, please feel free to get in touch with the DME for Peace team. Thank you once again to Gabrielle and Dani. We're going to be back next week with Scarlett Casamadas of Peace Direct, and you'll have more information about that webinar in your inbox in the next 24 hours. Thank you all and have a great week.
Thanks so much. Take care.